In 2015, behind the rusted doors of an abandoned storage unit in Shelton, Washington, something extraordinary lay hidden. When it was finally opened, no one expected to find a battered red race car standing silently inside, its paint faded and lifeless, its identity all but erased with only a faint, barely legible name clinging to its surface. Unser. At first glance, it looked like junk, but it wasn't junk. This forgotten machine was the very first car that a future four-time Indianapolis 500 champion had ever driven at the Brickyard. A piece of motorsport history. One that had been lost, discarded, and somehow remained completely overlooked for decades. And then comes the part that makes absolutely no sense. This car didn't belong there. Somehow it had traveled 2,300 miles from Indianapolis to the Pacific Northwest, leaving behind no records, no traces, and no explanation. It was as if it had simply vanished from one place and quietly reappeared in another, leaving behind a mystery that no one has ever been able to solve. But the truth is, this isn't an isolated incident. Throughout the history of racing, legendary cars haven't merely retired. They have vanished, left behind amidst disasters, buried beneath years of dust, or simply cast aside as worthless scrap. One Ferrari was abandoned in the middle of a storm after being deemed a total loss. A championship-winning Indy car? It was literally salvaged from a garbage dump. These aren't just lost vehicles. They are stories so incredible they seem too far-fetched to be true, except that they are. Today we are lifting the veil on some of the most astonishing cases in the world of racing, instances where famous cars vanished without a trace, and recounting the incredible moments when they were found once again. Number 5. The 1965 Indianapolis 500 featured a rookie class often cited as the most talented in history. While Mario Andretti claimed Rookie of the Year honors that year, Al Unser Sr., who would eventually become one of only 4 drivers to win the Indy 500 4 times, nearly missed the grid entirely due to a mechanical gamble that vanished for half a century. In 1965, the performance gap at the Brickyard was stark. While A.J. Foyt took the pole at 161.233 miles per hour, Unser's initial vehicle struggled to hit 151 miles per hour. This roughly 6.3% deficit in velocity meant Unser was originally strapped into a machine that was fundamentally non-competitive. Unser was originally driving the Arciero Special, a unique hybrid featuring a Pete Weisman chassis and a Maserati engine. In an era where Ford V8 and Offenhauser engines dominated the track, the Maserati power plant simply could not keep pace. In a desperate attempt to close the 10 miles per hour gap, team owner Frank Arciero authorized the use of nitromethane, a volatile fuel typically reserved for drag racing. Instead of providing a speed boost, the chemical cocktail caused a catastrophic engine failure. After failing to qualify in the Arciero car, Unser switched to a backup Lotus Ford provided by A.J. Foyt, ultimately finishing 9th and launching a career where he would lead a record 644 laps at Indy. Following the race, the original Arciero Maserati began an improbable journey, traveling approximately 2,340 miles from Indianapolis to a remote property in Shelton, Washington. For nearly 50 years, the vehicle's location remained a total vacuum in the historical record, hidden in plain sight until the 2000s. It was eventually rediscovered through an online listing by a vintage race car builder who noticed the faded Arciero in Unser lettering, still visible under layers of grime. The car was later purchased by NASCAR Hall of Fame crew Chief Ray Evernham, who moved it to North Carolina for preservation before it was acquired and fully restored by Big Machine Label Group founder Scott Borchetta. Today, the car is a fully operational piece of motorsport history, representing the literal starting line of a legendary racing dynasty. Number 4. The 1961 Gulf Oil Corvette was essentially a ghost, a high-performance phantom born from a secret rebellion inside General Motors. At a time when GM's front office enforced a rigid ban on racing, chief engineer Zora Arkus Duntov operated in the shadows, leaking elite hardware to the public through a paperwork loophole. By masking radical racing components under boring production codes like RPO 315, Duntov gave privateers a weapon that technically didn't exist. This car was the crown jewel of that underground movement, delivered to Gulf Oil executive Grady Davis and prepped by the iconic Don Yenko. The machine was a statistical powerhouse for its era. Under the hood sat a 283 cubic inch fuel-injected V8 that churned out 315 horsepower. To put that in perspective, achieving over 1 horsepower per cubic inch was a feat of engineering that most manufacturers couldn't touch in 1961. On the track, the results were even more lopsided. Commanded by Dr. Dick Thompson, the flying dentist, the car tore through the SCCA circuit, claiming 11 victories in a single season. This dominance wasn't just a streak, it was a 73% win rate that secured back-to-back national championships and proved that Duntov's secret parts were superior to anything else on the grid. Yet, the most haunting part of its story is how it nearly evaporated from history. After 1963, the car was stripped of its glory, painted over, and sold into the mundane life of a daily driver. It spent 27 years in total anonymity, its championship pedigree buried under layers of cheap paint and civilian modifications. It took a forensic-level investigation in 1990 for author Richard Prince to realize that this ordinary Corvette was the long-lost Gulf legend. Now fully restored and enshrined in the National Corvette Museum, the car stands as a monument to the engineers who risked their careers to ensure the Corvette became a world-class racer, even when their own company told them to stop. Number 3. The Ford GT40 Mark I Chassis P/1056 is a mechanical ghost that defies the typical life cycle of a $1 million supercar. While Ford's total performance era in the 1960s was defined by high-speed violence at Le Mans, this specific vehicle was part of a vanishingly small production run of just 31 road-going units. Owning one today is entering a club that represents less than 0.0003% of Ford's total 1966 output. While its siblings were being pushed to their limits on the track, P/1056 was destined for a quiet suburban exile that would last nearly half a century. For 43 consecutive years, this GT40 remained entombed in a residential garage, shielded from the world by a mountain of household clutter and 2 other sleeping classics. From the mid-1980s until its rediscovery, the car was effectively frozen in time. The odometer became a static relic of the 1970s, a decade when the second owner still treated it as a functional machine rather than a museum piece. Despite the skyrocketing value of the Blue Oval Legends, the owner famously rebuffed every 6-figure and 7-figure offer that came his way, choosing to live out his life with the car rather than the cash. The true value of P/1056 isn't just in its rarity, but in its unbroken DNA. When the dust was finally cleared, historians found a vehicle that had escaped the upgrades and modifications that ruin most vintage racers. It still houses its original 289 cubic inch V8, its factory drivetrain, and even the fragile fabric seat straps, components that usually dry rot within 20 years. In a financial landscape where road cars now trade for $7.5 million and elite competition models have breached the $13.2 million barrier as of 2025, this car is more than just a find. It is a 4-wheeled time capsule that proves silence is sometimes the best way to preserve a legend. Number 2. The Ferrari collection that hid in silence while the market exploded around it. In the 1970s, owning a Ferrari wasn't the financial flex it is today. Adjusted for inflation, many used Ferraris traded for the equivalent of 6 to 10 lakh rupees in today's terms, often less than a new luxury sedan. That's when Walter Medlin began quietly accumulating them. No showroom displays, no auctions, just private purchases, one after another. By the early 1980s, he had assembled nearly 20 cars, storing them out of sight near Lake Tohopekaliga. The centerpiece was something far more serious than a road car. A Ferrari 512 BB Competizione, built in extremely limited numbers, just 3 factory-prepared examples, it was designed for high-speed endurance racing. Its 5.0-liter flat 12 engine pushed close to 460 horsepower, allowing top speeds beyond 300 kilometers per hour on long straights. When it entered the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 1978, under Luigi Cinetti's North American racing team, it performed competitively before retiring late due to gearbox failure, a fate shared by roughly 1 in 3 cars in endurance races of that period. Then something unusual happened. Not a dramatic crash or sale, but disappearance through inaction. While the global collector market surged in the 1980s and 1990s, Ferrari values rising by over 300% in some segments, Medlin's cars didn't move. They sat untouched, unpolished, and largely undocumented. In a market driven by visibility, his collection effectively didn't exist. That invisibility was shattered in 2004, when Hurricane Charlie struck with winds exceeding 240 kilometers per hour. The storage structure collapsed, leaving nearly 24 cars exposed. Salt air, moisture, and debris accelerated deterioration in ways restorers usually spend years trying to reverse. Yet instead of selling, Medlin relocated everything to a warehouse near the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And once again, the cars vanished from public awareness. By the time the collection finally surfaced after his death, the market had completely transformed. What were once overlooked machines had become blue-chip assets. The group sold for over $16 million, with the 512 BB Competizione alone nearing $1.5 million, still wearing elements of its original race identity after more than 4 decades. What makes this story compelling isn't just rarity, it's contrast. While most collectors preserve value through constant restoration and exposure, this collection gains significance through isolation. In fact, specialists estimate that fewer than 15 to 20% of competition Ferraris from the 1970s still retain authentic, traceable history. These cars didn't survive because they were protected. They survived because they were forgotten at exactly the right time. Number 1, the machine that forced NASCAR to change the rules and then nearly disappeared. At the end of the 1960s, speed on oval tracks wasn't just about horsepower, it was about air. To gain an edge, Dodge engineered the Dodge Charger Daytona as a purpose-built aerodynamic weapon. Only 503 units were produced to satisfy NASCAR requirements, but their real impact came on the track. With a drag coefficient significantly lower than standard muscle cars of the era, the Daytona became the first stock-bodied racer to officially exceed 200 miles per hour, 322 kilometers per hour. At superspeedways, even a 5 to 7% aerodynamic efficiency gain could translate into several miles per hour advantage, often the difference between leading and trailing in a pack. The dominance was short-lived but decisive. Within a year, NASCAR imposed restrictions that effectively ended the winged car era, making the Daytona part of a very small group of vehicles whose performance directly triggered rule changes in a major sport. Decades later, one example told a completely different story. Less about speed, more about neglect. Discovered by Charlie Lyons in Alabama, the car had spent roughly 40 years sitting idle under minimal cover. Unlike most collector-grade Daytonas, which are often restored multiple times over their lifespan, this one had simply aged. The paint had oxidized, interior materials had degraded, and environmental exposure had taken a visible toll. Yet structurally, it remained largely intact. What made it especially valuable was its originality. It still retained its factory-installed 440 Magnum Fu 8 and transmission, a numbers matching condition seen in a shrinking percentage of classic muscle cars. Experts estimate fewer than 25 to 30% of surviving high-performance cars from that era maintain fully original drivetrains. The odometer reading, just over 20,000 miles, further suggested limited use before it was parked. Financially, the contrast is striking. While pristine Daytonas, especially rare Hemi variants, have crossed the $1 million mark, unrestored examples like this occupy a different niche. When it sold for around $90,000, the price reflected not just condition, but a growing trend in the collector market, appreciation for untouched, as-found vehicles. In recent years, auction data shows barn find cars can command premiums of 20 to 40% over restored equivalents due to their authenticity. This Daytona story isn't just about rarity, it's about timing. Built to dominate at over 300 kilometers per hour, it spent most of its life standing still. And yet, by doing nothing, it preserved something most restored cars lose: a direct, unfiltered connection to the moment when engineering briefly outran the rulebook.